Book announcement, .NET DevOps for Azure.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome back to the Azure DevOps Podcast. You can go to www.azuredevops.show to see show notes and past episodes. And we've got some great recent shows lately if you haven't looked back at the catalog. And today, rather than having a guest, we're actually going to do a special Microsoft Build Edition. And this week in Seattle, the Microsoft Build Conference is happening. And if you're there, you're having a lot of fun. Hope to see you. I'm there as well. And if you're not there, you can watch the keynote sessions live streaming. They have a tendency to stream some of the sessions. And the Build Conference used to be, it's from the lineage of the Microsoft Professional Developers Conference. And it's basically what is coming up in the Microsoft development technologies and where the vision is going and what the future holds. Whereas Microsoft Ignite, which came from the Microsoft Tech Ed lineage, is all about training and what you can do today and with the released products and how you should be using the tools and the products today. So the Microsoft Build Conference is always forward-looking, and so it's really exciting just to see what's coming down the line and be prepared for what's coming. So my latest book I'm releasing in conjunction with the Build Conference. It's called .NET DevOps for Azure. And this is actually my fourth book. I've written 3 different editions of the ASP.NET MVC in Action series, going all the way back to 2009, I believe, might have been the first edition. And so you can go back and look at those. Of course, with .NET Core coming out, those are a little bit out of date at this point. So the title of the book is .NET DevOps for Azure. And I'm just going to read a couple sections. And specifically, I'm going to read the paragraph about the book because this book is a long time coming and it hopes to address what's a big issue in our industry. So this is from the About the Book session. This book has been a culmination of a long-time vision, some key leadership, and a confluence of industry events. Almost 15 years ago, the author gained a passion for helping developers succeed, for making the complex simple, and for finding rules of thumb that would work for around 80% of situations. With too many options in the software world and too many answers of, quote, it depends, the industry has been starved for the ability to do something, quote, by the book. And this book seeks to provide that text where a .NET developer can say, quote, I'm doing DevOps with .NET and Azure by the book, end quote. In this manner, one would know what models and patterns were in play and what to expect from said environment. This book is being released while .NET Core 3 is in preview status, and therefore the version of the book should be considered preview as well. The examples largely use Visual Studio 2019 Preview Edition. The code itself and Azure DevOps Services pipeline configuration, they function perfectly well with .NET Core 2.2, however, and can be used to implement applications immediately. And it is the intent of the author to release a .NET Core 3 edition aligning with Microsoft's release schedule. The example configuration used throughout this book can be leveraged through a public repository and source code repository online at dev.azure.com/clearmeasurelabs/onion-devops-architecture. Around May of 2018, I believe it was outside of a VS Live conference in Austin, Scott Hunter and I had lunch, and we talked about the issue, especially in the Microsoft ecosystem, about how there is documentation about every technology out there, and there's books that go deep into particular technologies, and there's blogs, and there's podcasts that talk about individual things. but there's no text that brings it all together that says, okay, you are a Visual Studio developer and you're writing you're building a piece of .NET software, and how do you do it? How do you bring all the different pieces together so that it comes out well? And recognizing that there are only a finite number of choices. There's only a finite number of choices that you can pick when putting together your application. You can have a web application as a part of that Visual Studio solution or larger software system, or you can have multiple web applications. You could have some offline job, whether it's triggered with a queue or whether it runs on a schedule. But either way, it's an offline job. And then you can have any number of those. You can have a transactional normalized SQL Server database. You can have a denormalized OLAP style star schema analytics database or data warehouse. You can have JSON collection storage. You can have blob file storage. There's a finite number of application types when it all comes down to how software runs. And you just look at the list of most commonly used services in Azure in order to run code, and you can see that that's a finite list. And so as an industry, we need just regular guidance for those basic building blocks. And with those basic building blocks, Scott and I believe that it can cover at least 80% of developer cases. Now, there are some specialized technology companies that are really pushing the bounds, that are not only using the products, but are well over the borderline of doing research and development and inventing new things. But for the thousands and thousands of development teams out there that are using the tools in order to build software that is what in the industry would be considered normal. Now, what the software does is unique, it's custom, but it's normal. It has one or a few web applications, one or a few offline jobs, one or a few databases or data stores, and maybe it has some mobile applications that are part of it, Android, iPhone, and maybe it has even a Windows desktop application that's part of the system. But it's still a finite number, and we need guidance, overall guidance. And so that's what this book hopes to do. This book doesn't go deep into any particular application type. This book says, okay, you're using Visual Studio. You have a Visual Studio solution, and it is comprised of a number of things. Let's take the most common. And it does. It takes the most common things today, which is web applications, offline jobs, and SQL Server database. And it concentrates on those and how to put together a complete DevOps environment, soup to nuts, from how to organize source control, how to integrate source control with work tracking, how to do your private build for the commit stage of continuous integration, how to do a continuous integration build, how to put together the Visual Studio solution, how to manage dependencies within the Visual Studio solution, so that it's not just spaghetti code or all of the logic ends up in the UI, how to integrate automated database migrations so that the structure of your database can be stored in Visual Studio along with the code, and you have a way to recreate that database schema locally, as well as reliably upgrade it in downstream environments. And along with that, it includes guidance for putting together a continuous delivery pipeline, and talks about the essential minimum 3 environment types that exist in any continuous delivery pipeline, along with multi-layers of testing and how to configure those. The three quality control steps that are kind of proven and demonstrated by industry research, that if you put those together, you're going to get in the high 90s of defect removal and resultingly high quality. Centralized logging and telemetry, all of that works together, and pulling together the Microsoft tools that are appropriate for all of these methods. Azure DevOps services, the appropriate services within your Azure subscription, the tools and the libraries available on NuGet and in Visual Studio 2019, and a few techniques to use with C# and library and dependency management. and what to do on the local workstation versus what to do on a build server versus what to do when deploying to environments, how to recreate environments, how to manage feature branches and make sure that you don't conflict environment-wise because you might have multiple feature branches going and you want those to benefit from a continuous integration build and running all of your tests. And it covers how to manage and automatically provision environments that are appropriate for feature branches. So there's a lot of guidance. It covers the full breadth of guidance for doing .NET development today when you're targeting Azure. Now, I would say most of the guidance in this book works equally well if you are in your own data center with your own Windows Server virtual machines. So there are a few environment-specific things for Azure, but most of it's perfectly appropriate, even if you're deploying on your own servers. And so if you are a .NET developer, if you are a, quote, Microsoft shop, then this book is for you. If you're going to .NET Core and SQL Server and you're looking ahead to Azure, then this book is for you. It brings it all together. Now, if you're going deep into ASP.NET Core, then of course you're going to want to have an ASP.NET text as well for all of the different ins and outs of Razor and the middleware pipeline. If you're using a JavaScript framework on top, then you're going to want to have supplementing texts that do go deep into aspects that you've chosen. But this book seeks to cover the full breadth and bring it all together. And so there is a example application that comes with the book, and you can find that example application on the public project, dev.azure.com/clearmeasurelabs/onion-devops-architecture. And that Git repository is public. By all means, go and clone it and learn from it. Use it for whatever you need to. And in addition, it has a public configuration for the Azure DevOps Services pipeline, soup to nuts, all inclusive, with tests, with code coverage, with static analysis, with everything that you would need to pack into your build and deploy pipeline, right there, ready to go, and ARM templates for the automatic creation of the appropriate paths, resources in Azure.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
This is the preview edition of the book. We're looking forward to later on when we can revise it for .NET Core 3 and some of the really, really interesting things that are coming out about the same time frame as .NET Core 3. So look for another edition there. But all of the methods and all of the techniques and practices you can implement today with .NET Core 2, and the Visual Studio solution that's there is .NET Core 2, and you can see how we isolate dependencies even in there and how we keep them off to the side and use those practices. One of the techniques I'm especially excited about when it comes to operations is having a pattern that is a type of hub and spoke architecture in your application. For instance, if you seek to query all of those logs in a centralized location, then you need to figure out how to instrument the whole application. And if your entire application is transaction script or top down and doesn't have any pinch points that a hub and spoke architecture gives you, then you're going to be smattering the whole application. That's a technical term, smattering the whole application with log statements or recording metrics or custom events. And you're going to be sprinkling those statements all over the application. Now, if your application has any type of hub and spoke architecture, then the pages and the individual features are the spokes around the outside, And everything that the application does, every button that the user clicks, everything that they do, every command that they run flows through a centralized pipeline or centralized choke point. So a bus pattern would be a type of hub and spoke architecture where every button, behind every button in the UI, we just capture the user's intent, what the user is wanting to do, into an object, and then we send that object down the bus. And you can look up the bus pattern, and you can have multiple different pieces of code that are observing the bus to see what comes down it. And that's where you can have a command. If you've heard of command query, commands, queries, and events, you can have objects of that type, send it down the bus, and then you have handler classes that are kind of listening and say, oh, do I know how to handle that type of command, or do I know how to handle that type of query, or am I interested in a particular type of event? And they can see that it's coming down. Now, what that allows is for all of your telemetry and eventing and log statements to be centralized. You just have to essentially add it as an observer on the bus, and then you don't have to sprinkle log and telemetry statements all over your application everywhere. You centralize it. So if you're thinking about the solid principles, the single responsibility principle in particular, and dry, don't repeat yourself, you really do want to have central places that do things. And so this is one of those ways, and the skeleton application that comes along with this book does demonstrate that technique as well. Now, one of the common glyphs that is out there on the web, if you just search for images of DevOps, you're going to get this sideways figure eight or this infinity symbol that kind of loops around dev and then loops around ops and comes back, and it has, I think, plan, create, verify, package, release, configure, monitor, and then it goes back to plan. And it's a cycle around dev and ops. And then, of course, the QA people and the creative people have come back and say, whoa, dev and ops, you're leaving QA out, you're leaving ops. And so they end up creating these Venn diagrams, but none of those really do what the whole DevOps mindset has sought to do, which is to obliterate the differences with dev and ops, to not just bring them together. For instance, in the enterprise where there's big division and departments and layers of middle management around development, and the same thing around operations departments, then yes, there's a lot of cultural and organizational work necessary to bring those organizations together. But there's so many startup companies, and there's so many smaller technology organizations at well-established, traditionally non-technology companies, that this divide has never even come to pass. And so all of the talk about bringing dev and ops back together, that's totally valid in the enterprise space with massive IT departments. But the thousands and thousands of companies that have never created the divide, it doesn't really do much other than suggest, hey, do we need to have these separated? And so in DevOps, just like it was several decades ago, if you built it, you run it. And if you're running it, you need to be able to change it. It's all one and the same. And so I don't like that sideways figure eight. And so the image and the glyph that we have in the book is not a sideways figure eight, but it is a single cycle. It's a multi-layer single cycle. That's why we call it onion DevOps architecture. And in the center is the automated DevOps pipeline. And then there's other layers around it that give that hyperspeed cycle capability. The layers are best practices, defect removal, team workflow, architecture blueprints, and then cloud operations. And the cycle around the edge is plan, code, integrate, package, release, operate, learn, and then goes back to plan. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to iterate through and around that cycle faster and faster and faster. And we want to spin around the hub of the automated DevOps pipeline and constantly increase our cycle time. It's interesting. One of the podcast guests a few months ago, Sam Guggenheimer, he shared that in not only in the Scrum world, but in the larger context of the industry, there's been some studies and about how often we are right when it comes to prioritization and making decisions, and we're right about a third of the time. And for instance, in Scrum, there's a role called the product owner. And the product owner prioritizes. The product owner is supposed to be the absolute expert in what the customer needs. And it turns out about a third of the time, the product owner is right. And we push out what was prioritized, and it's a benefit, and it really helps the situation. And then another third of the time, the work is done, the release gets pushed out, and the new functionality or the new changes don't really make a difference whatsoever. And then a third of the time, those are pushed out to production, and they actually hurt the situation. And so in those cases, you want to hurry up and you want to undo those things as fast as possible. Of course, you need the DevOps intelligence in order to know that. You need the telemetry, you need the data analytics to be able to know very, very quickly which one of those it is. But it's interesting that it lines up about a third. So that means that we need to give a higher priority to a faster cycle time, knowing that if we gave super high priority to the planning process and the prioritization and the release mapping, which the industry has been investing in a lot over the last decade and a half, the track record is still a third. And so even with sophisticated product management, that's going to be the case. We have to have a super fast cycle time so that we can change things. We can learn, we can change, we can learn, we can change, we can learn, we can change, we can learn. And we need the change process to become a non-issue and shrink. So that's an overview. That's a summary of the book. And in the book, again, we go through a example Visual Studio solution and Azure DevOps Services configuration, and we get concrete, and there's a public project, but we also draft up models for everything. We draft up a pictorial architectural model for the process view, for the development environment. And then furthermore, we go through the models to think about how to put together your private build, how to put together your Visual Studio solution. And I'll just give you some high points in those. For instance, when we talk about a Git repository and how to structure a Git repository, there's some rules and there's some relationships, there's some cardinality in there, and one of those is one built and released piece of software per Git repository. And so, for instance, I'll walk you through one of these models, and if you're going to go through the book, it's on page 118. You have a software team, and a team can have many Git repositories, and a software system overall could be segmented so that it is developed by many teams, and therefore a software system can be comprised of many Git repositories. But a Git repository can only be owned by one team. It's a recipe for chaos if you take a single Git repository that has a build on it and have it owned by one team. Now, there are people that break this rule, but in general, this book seeks to not say, well, it depends, because we have some very sophisticated, very capable technology companies who are doing it a certain way. We are giving the guidance for the 80% of the teams out there, the rules of thumb out there. And so the guidance that we give in this book will work. You will fall into the pit of success. If you do it this way by the book, it will work and you will succeed. Now, as you become an expert in one of these areas, you may elect to make modifications and do it a different way. And that's great. But if you don't know which way to go, if you don't know how to make a particular decision, then do it by the book. And then when you get familiar, you can choose to change it. But the way in the book will work in 80% of the situations. It is the general guidance. So if you're just getting started with a DevOps pipeline configuration or putting together an entire environment that is destined for unattended, hands-off, automated deployments, and everything that has to go ahead of that, then follow this guidance and it will work. And once you're completely versed in it, then you can analyze a particular section and make decisions and change it. But get started this way. So we have a Git repository. A Git repository has one versioned application. Largely that translates into one Visual Studio solution, because one Visual Studio solution can have, it can have as many components as it needs to, but it is one versioned software application, and one Visual Studio solution resides in one Git repository. Now, the software system can be segmented into many versioned software applications, regardless if you're just segmenting the software system into two, or if you are going for microservices with truly independent and autonomous services to make up that system. Either way, each one of them is an application. A microservice is an application type. And so each version software application has one continuous integration build. It has one software build configuration, and one build configuration builds only one versioned software application. And so as we go through, largely it comes down to a team can have one or many Git repositories, and then each Git repository has an automated DevOps pipeline. So we walk through each individual step there. We give the model that we are implementing. We show how to implement the model. And then we go on to the next one. We show how to organize the Visual Studio solution, the source control repository, the commands to use. Every chapter has a small bibliography that refers to other texts, because nothing in this book was invented. Everything in this book is adapted and synthesized from other works of some type. All of us stand on the shoulders of everyone in the industry that has come before us, and this book is no exception. And so it synthesizes so much guidance. It refers back to extreme programming. It refers back to test-driven development. It refers how trunk-based development fits in, which, interestingly enough, trunk-based development is based on branching. So it's just short-lived branching. So it's interesting that trunk-based development is the name. But we also give the model for the structure and the workflow of a build process, both the private build process and the continuous integration build process, and then also how to handle environments. So the book is out. And we'll include a link in the show notes for how to purchase the preview edition of the book directly from the book printer. It will be going on Amazon very quickly, but for now you'll have to purchase directly from the book manufacturer, which will be on lulu.com, and you can search for .NET DevOps on lulu.com and buy the book now, and they will print it right there for you just for the short period of time before you can purchase it on Amazon or other retailers. And we hope you enjoy it. We also, if you're at the Build Conference, we hope you enjoy the Build Conference. And that's all for today. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.